Welcome everyone who is watching the presentation. The purpose of this presentation is to take a look at the Canadian Corps' advantages in 1918. Up to that date, the Canadian Corps was functionally identical to similar British formations with three important differences. The first, it was a semi-independent national force, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Its personnel were a mix of Canadian and British born soldiers, and its command cadre was overwhelmingly, like to the point of 75% amateurs and militia officers. Only a quarter were regular officers. But in 1918, the Canadian Corps changes. It starts gaining some important advantages that differentiate it from British formations. And that is what I want to talk about. Now, many of these are well understood, but there's a number that have been perhaps not appreciated to a full extent, some that have been misrepresented, and some have just been entirely missed. And that's the ones that I'm going to be focusing on. So this all starts in February 1918, when the War Office proposes to the Canadians that they follow the British lead and reduce the number of battalions per brigade to 3. This would free up units that would allow the Canadians to form a 6th division, because they have 4 at the front, 1 in England. That would then also allow them to form another corps in a small army for Arthur Currie, the commander of the corps. Despite the prospect of a significant promotion, Currie took a principled stance against this proposal. He argued that first, it would mean breaking up a proven combat team at the brigade level. Secondly, it would add a lot of overhead for not a great gain in combat power. And most importantly, for the Canadian authorities, it meant to retreat from Canadianization, because these new formations would require British staff officers to fill out the ranks, and Canadians were not happy with that prospect. He proposed instead to improve the existing organization, flesh it out, make it stronger, and a whole series of wide-ranging modifications at the logistics support and at the infantry level. And somewhat surprisingly, GHQ agreed to these changes, or almost all of them. So why? Well, first, the changes that Currie was proposing were not radical. They were extensions of existing policy, and in many cases, ones that the British would have liked to have implemented themselves. But it was also a function of Currie's understanding of the tactical and operational imperatives of fighting on the Western Front, the unique position of the Canadian Corps, and I'll talk a bit more about that, as well as Currie and the Corps standing with Haig. Haig had a lot of respect for Currie. And finally, Canada, thanks to conscription, had the Manpower Reserves. Now, if this was such a good idea, why did not the BEF follow suit? Well, they're at the end of the manpower pool, and the British political authorities had decided they wanted to maximize the number of divisions. They wanted to trade off more divisions, albeit weaker, for fewer, stronger divisions. In the Canadian case, they had the luxury of maintaining the same number of divisions, but increasing and making them stronger. So I mentioned in the introduction that the Canadians by 1917 into 1918 were a semi-independent force. So they are still plugged into the British operational logistics, administration logistics system, but they do have some leeway. And why is this? Well, first of all, there's the strong record of the Canadian Corps. It won great victories at Vimy, at Hill 70, at Passchendaele. But there's also the nature of Canada's contribution. Beyond the 4 divisions and the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, the Canadians fielded 13 railway battalions that were an important component of the railway service in France and Flanders. There were 57 forestry companies that in England and France cut word that saved literally millions of board feet of shipping. Canada sent over to England vast quantities of grain, meat, raw materials. A quarter of the 18-pounder shells fired on the Western Front were made in Canada. And 4 of the top 10 aces in the RAF were Canadian, as was up to 20% of the pilots. So Canada, as the senior dominion, is pulling its weight, and the British are going to bend over backwards to make sure Canada stays on side. So one of the responses or actions out of this is that the Canadians are not as tightly coupled. They are different from a British Corps. In one respect is Canada, or in the form of Curry, has a get out of jail card. That is, he can appeal to his political masters if something goes wrong or if something he does not agree with. And he played this card in March 1918. So at the height of the German Spring Offensive, Haig broke up the Canadian Corps, much to Curry's disenchantment. He contacted his political masters, who in turn leaned on the British government, who forced Haig to bring the Canadians together. And he was still complaining about that months later. So both Haig and Curry knew that Curry had a get out of jail card. He's not going to use it willy-nilly, but on something that's really important, he is going to deploy that, something that no British Corps commander had access to. It also meant the Corps remain together. Now, at times, Canadian divisions might be detached for a while, but overall, they are going to remain with the Corps. That allowed the development of a common doctrine, and I'll be talking about that in a couple of slides. And then there's a working knowledge between the various levels within the Canadian Corps, because they are always working together. Now, I want to contrast this with the 51st Highland Division. It joined the Canadians briefly during the Battle of Second Arras from the 26th of August to the 3rd of September. And when it joined, it was serving with its 50th Corps. There is no common doctrine. There is no working knowledge when you are being dropped from corps to corps to corps. All right. So the heart of the changes that the Canadians implemented was thanks to conscription. After the fall election in 1917, conscription was imposed, and now there was a flow of manpower and guaranteed manpower to the Canadian forces. So what Curry is doing, he's going to increase the establishments. In the case of the infantry, he retains the 4-battalion brigade, but he also adds an extra 100 men to each battalion, and he greatly expands the support and logistics arms within the Corps. The result is Canadian divisions are 50% larger than a British division. British are running 14,000 men and change. Canadians are around 21,000 and change. Result of all of this is that the Corps' divisions greatly increased effectiveness and are able to retain their combat edge for longer. In colloquial terms, it means that Canadians can pound harder and pound longer. Now, one of the major benefits or advantages the Canadians had was an 8-week training period. Starting in May 1918, the Canadian Corps, or at least the 1st, 3rd, and 4th divisions, were pulled out of the line and underwent progressive open warfare training, going from the platoon level all the way to multiple brigades in action. And this is not just its infantry, it's machine guns, it's mortars, artillery, tanks, aircraft, engineers, medical, logistics, signals. It's the entire gamut of the Corps, and it has an important impact on the Corps' operations in the war. Now, I want to contrast this with our friends, the 51st Highland Division. So the division was smashed in March, crushed in April, decimated at 2nd Marne in August and July 1918. So when it arrives at the Canadian Corps, it's a hollow shell of its former self, and it asks for time for training. It only gets enough to do individual training, that's musketry, drill, etc., during the in the lead up before the attack at Second Arras. So there's an enormous contrast in the level of training. The result is that the Canadian Corps is transformed. Earlier, I mentioned the ability to create a doctrine. It's not just create, but it is to inculcate and then enforce that doctrine. And that was what this training period did. And you can see the difference at Passchendaele. Canadian advances are measured in hundreds of yards. It takes 4 days between attacks before the Canadians can respond, whereas during the 100 days, Canadians are advancing thousands of yards. Attacks are taking place with hours of preparation. Density of combat troops is a third of what it was in 1917. There is a totally different approach. Now, you may have noticed that when I talked about the Corps being pulled out, the 2nd Division was not part of it. It remained outside of that training. And while it performed very well at the battalion level, As a division, it was slow, lethargic, torpid in comparison to the other three divisions. It consistently attacked after the other divisions, in large part because it did not have that opportunity for open warfare training. Now, a major change that I think is pretty well understood is that of engineers, but there are some implications that may not be as well appreciated. So Currie expands the engineers in each division to a brigade consisting of 3 battalions. As a result, now the engineers not only provide expertise, but they also provide the labor to do the work. They no longer have to rely on disinterested and exhausted infantry to do the work. Benefit of this is the work is done faster and more effectively, but just as importantly, it meant it did not wear out the infantry. So in the case of the British and the Canadians prior to this, infantry had 3 functions. You had to march, you had to fight, you had to provide work parties, and hopefully you would have time left over for training and for rest. Well, in the Canadian case, they no longer have to provide working parties, so now they can spend more time in rest and in training. And as you can see in the war diaries, that immediately after an action, the units are given a rest and they go immediately back to training, whereas British formations, that time for resting and training is split between having to provide work parties. Now, one that is not all that important, but I think it's an interesting proxy for just how lavish was the Corps is typewriters. Now, today, typewriters are a very old form, archaic kind of technology, but in 1918, it's the cutting edge of business technology. It is a signifier of modernity, but they are expensive and difficult to obtain. So to test this, I looked at every war diary of Canadian infantry battalions, brigades, and divisions, British brigades and divisions on the Western Front in August 1918 to see what percentage of them were using typewriters to type up their war diaries. So in the case of Canadian battalions, 79% of them were using typewriters. British divisions, it's only 71%. So Canadian battalions, 2 levels below the level of a division, are more likely to have a typewriter than a British division. Now, an important item that has not been really discussed much are tramways. So that is the light rail system that links the heavy gauge or broad gauge railway at the railhead to the front line and provides an important supplement to the logistics infrastructure of not having to rely on roads. So within the BEF that's under the control of GHQ, there is a limit of 200 miles of maintained line across the entire front. So if you want to add 2 miles, you've got to take 2 miles out of service. And further, during the 100 days, decision is made that only the broad gauge lines are going to be extended because they can carry 10 times the tonnage of light rail. In the Canadian case is a different situation. Uniquely, the Canadians have 2 tramway companies assigned permanently to the Corps. One is for maintenance or operations, and one for construction. Further, the Canadians do not count against that 200-mile limit. The Canadians can do whatever they want, basically, in part because they have been, by some measurements, are about 4 times more efficient, that they can carry 4 times the amount of tonnage than a comparable British unit on a rail line. Further, the Canadians were allowed to extend their light rail during the 100 days. And this became really important during the Second Battle of Arras because the sector they were in is very poorly served by broad gauge rail. The nearest railhead is on the wrong side of Arras. So by 29th of August, remember the battle starts on the 26th, the Canadian supply lines are getting stretched almost to the point of snapping, and there has to be rationing imposed on the use of artillery shells. Well, the Canadians devoted a lot of resources, like 1/3 of their engineering resources, to extending the rail line or the light rail lines. And by the 30th of August, they had reached far enough that the constriction on the supply line was removed. So the benefit of tramways was that it was improved logistics, and basically what it allowed the Canadians to do is for every day but one of the battle, they were able to attack in a major way the German line. As a result, the Germans never had a breathing space. They never had a chance to catch their breath before the Canadians attacked and smashed them again every morning, over and over again. And to just give you a sense of just how important this was, the major attack was on the 2nd of September that broke the Drocourt-Queant line. And the 1st Division of 7 field artillery brigades had all of that ammunition that they fired off delivered by tramways. An item that tends to get, I think, misunderstood is the Canadians had extra trucks and guns. So the Canadians had 2 extra mechanical transport companies or truck companies assigned. The personnel were all Category A men. Category A meaning these are troops capable of serving at the front line. In British units, they're Category B, that because of injury or debility cannot stand the rigors of the front line. Canadians also had 3 field artillery brigades permanently assigned. Now, what this is, people have suggested is that the Canadians had more trucks and more guns than the British formations. But this is a little misleading, because depending on what a formation was doing, a corps, if it's in an attack, is going to be reinforced with trucks and reinforced with field artillery brigades. So you cannot say that it means the Canadians had more. They had more dedicated trucks and more dedicated guns, but there was still an advantage, because it meant that the Canadian Corps understood or knew that they would retain these formations throughout the battle. They did not have that concern that was with every corps, that they're going to get a call from Army that says, sorry, chaps, but you're going to have to give up your 2 mechanical transport and the 3 Canadian field artillery brigades. GHQ wants them. You knew that you were going to retain them. So that allowed them to develop the familiarity and working knowledge of how things were done within the Corps. And in respect to the truck companies, because the Canadian personnel are Category A men, they can work almost around the clock, whereas British units start to fall apart after about 12 hours. The result being Canadians get about twice as much tonnage out of a group of trucks as could the British. An item that is always missed is signals, because officially nothing changed. So the challenge was that the signal service was under great strain, even in trench warfare conditions. And even when they are advancing at hundreds of yards, when you're advancing thousands of yards at a time, it becomes an even greater challenge. So there weren't enough men within that service to provide all of the signal services. And the Canadians have extra units on top of this, and their units are larger, and they are constrained by how many by the limits of the establishment. So Currie proposes that about an extra 1,000 men be added to the signal service within the Corps. Unfortunately, this is one case where GHQ turned it down. The head of signals at the GHQ was not a particularly bright chap, and he turned them down. So what did Currie do? He did it anyways. So he worked with the Canadian authorities in England and agreed and made arrangements that 1,000 men were transferred to the Corps from various different locations and signal pools. Another advantage that Canadians had was that they had a priority on continuous wave wireless sets. So think of this as 5G when everyone is working at 3G. It's not so much that it's faster, but it has less interference, it has greater range, it's just a better technology. And the Second Army was complaining in September 1918 that 80% of this very difficult to obtain wireless set were going to the Canadian Corps. They were equipping the down to field artillery brigade levels. And we know that this is important case is that when the Canadians moved back from Amiens to Arras in August 1918, they had to turn off all their continuous wave sets because they were replacing the 17th Corps, which had no CW sets. So the Canadians have them down to the field artillery brigade level. There are none in the 17th Corps. So it'll give you a sense of what that means. The benefit of this is a far more responsive command. The Canadian Signal Service was pushed to the limit. They came close to collapsing a couple times because of the strain that was put onto it, but they did not break. And without that extra 1,000 men, it was difficult to imagine how they could have maintained the communications during the battle. So something that, another item that tends to get missed and gets lost is in addition to the Corps survey section. So this was the organization that was responsible for flash spotting, as well as providing the artillery boards for predictive fire, so that they would resect every artillery position so they could fire indirectly. Well, the Canadians had their survey section reinforced. So what the Canadians delivered was a series of posts, 3 across the front of the Corps, close to the front line, each equipped with observers and variety of people, where the information is connected back to the Canadian Corps headquarters by continuous wave radio. Remember, we mentioned them just a moment ago. So these posts provided flash spotting, so they could spot when the German artillery was fired, observation how the battle was going, scouts that went ahead to battalion headquarters to get the latest news, and interpreters, so that if a German officer was captured, he would be sent to this post and interrogated, and that information relayed back to the Canadian Corps artillery headquarters. As a result, Currie spent a lot of time at that headquarters because it was the best informed element anywhere within the Corps. What it does is it provided a telescope for the commanders to what was going on at the front and near real-time information to the Corps headquarters. So as a result, the best informed levels within the Canadian Corps was at the Corps level and battalions. Brigades and divisions were always behind the curve in finding out what was going on at the front. Now, an item that tends to get misrepresented is machine guns. So Currie added an extra machine gun company to the divisional machine gun battalion. So that's an extra 32 machine guns. So a British division would have 64, Canadians have 96. And these are large battalions. They're over 1,400 men each. In addition, like the British, the Canadians added a second Lewis machine gun to every platoon. So what Canadian historians have tended to do is that they add all these numbers up and then say, well, Canadians had so many more machine guns than did the British, and this is evidence of the Canadian belief in firepower. Well, the reality is, however, is that because Canadian battalions are 50% larger, you would expect that they should have more machine guns. And on a per capita basis, there's really not that much of a difference. So let me go through the math here. So you add up all the machine guns in the Corps, including 2 motor machine gun brigades, the division machine gun battalion, and all the light machine guns throughout the unit. It works out that on a 1,000-man Canadian battalion is supported by, or there's about 22 men per gun. Lower number is better. A British 1,000-man battalion is 23 men per gun. So it's a little bit higher, so not quite as good. However, there are no 1,000-man British infantry battalions in 1918. It's more like there's 750 men. The ratio then becomes 17.4 men per gun. So bottom line, on a per capita basis, the Canadians had no great advantage over the British. So in conclusion then, the changes that the Canadians were able to make in 1918 was built on the performance of the Corps in 1917. Without that and Haig's confidence in Currie, there would not have given the leeway to make those changes. The result was that the Canadians were more effective on a division basis, they're larger divisions, and they could retain their combat edge longer. And I'll give you an example of this. During the Second Battle of Arras, there was a 3-day battle for the Corps to reach jump-off positions to attack the Drocourt-Queant line on the 2nd of September. So the 4th British Division on the left and the 1st Canadian on the right had to chew their way through over the course of 3 days. Now, the 4th British Division faced weaker defenses and weaker defenders, and at the end of the 3 days, they were down to 2 effective brigades, whereas the 1st Canadian Division, with a longer front, had to fight full-strength German divisions, stronger defenses, and were still able to field 3 effective brigades when the attack went in on the 2nd of September. So this is not meant as a shot against the 4th British Division. It just highlights how much stronger and how much more stamina had the Canadian divisions because of the additions that Currie made. It also highlights the importance of conscription to the Canadian success. Now, up to fairly recently, Canadian historiography has argued that conscription was both a terrible thing because of the fractures and divisiveness that it created in Canada that exists to this day, and that further, conscription didn't really add enough men to make much of a difference. But now we understand that the conscription, you can still argue it shouldn't have been done, or at least done in the way that it was. It's still, you cannot argue that it did not have an impact on the performance of the Corps during the 1918. And especially none of the changes that I talked about would have been allowed were it not for conscription in Canada. It also highlights Currie's understanding of the imperatives of the Western Front. His changes were across the entire gamut of what the Corps did, and was all aimed at increasing the effectiveness of the Corps at the lowest possible cost. And finally, it highlights the unique status of the Canadians by 1918. And I'll give you two implications of what these larger divisions had on the BEF as a whole. So for tactical and rapid response, the British had formed omnibus companies that had capacity to move an entire infantry brigade from one part of the sector or the front to another. Well, with Canadian brigades consisting of 4 divisions and very large battalions in each case, 4 battalions per brigade, and each of these battalions larger, there was always a scramble to try and find enough transport to move the Canadians around. It even affected logistics. So the basic Corps logistics process was every day there would be a train that would leave from the French coast that would go to the location of each division at the front, and it would contain enough food, supplies, resources on a basic standard basis for a day. Well, with Canadian divisions 50% larger, they have to have special trains just for the Canadian Corps, which I think, again, highlights and reinforces the notion of the unique status of the Corps in 1918. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Bill, thanks ever so much indeed for that rapid and very enlightening presentation about the uniqueness of the Canadian Corps. I'm now going to go into the Q&A session and invite some of the many people who've asked questions to come and join us. Right, Paul, you're first. Paul, do you want to just unmute yourself?
So, yeah, it's a question for Bill, if I may. You mentioned conscripts in the CEF, and it came through quite clearly how conscripts enabled Currie to implement his plans for the CEF. Do you happen to know what Currie's view was before Robert Borden managed to secure conscription in Canada, please?
So Currie was very much in favor of it. He was very adamant that conscription was absolutely necessary. But what was puzzling was that he never made any public statement of that. So his counterpart in England, Richard Turner, wrote publicly in advocating for it. And I think one of the factors that I think led to the later estrangement between Currie and the government was his lack of public support for conscription. Currie was a liberal and Borden was a conservative, and Borden was pushing hard for conscription. And he was, I think, somewhat bitter about Currie's lack of public endorsement of conscription. Privately, Currie was all for it. Publicly, he never mentioned it.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Can I add something to that too, just very briefly? And Currie, Currie suffers a tremendous blow to his reputation over the war, which I spoke to this group maybe half a year ago, and it's really fascinating that what Bill has brought out here on the conscripts and Pat Dennis and other. Currie always had a real ambivalence towards the conscripts. As Bill has written in my edited book on 1919, Currie blamed the conscripts for a lot of the riots in 1919. So while Curry may have had understood their importance, as I think he did, he also had an ambivalent feeling towards them. It's quite a complex issue.
Thanks for your question there. Thanks. Rob Thompson.
Good
Hello,
evening, all. Excellent stuff, Tim. Excellent stuff, Bill. Being a logistics and engineering freak, my questions are going to be directed towards Bill. Not so much questions as points, really. I think also to begin with, we talked about you talked about the resilience of the Canadian Corps because of conscription and the size of the battalions and the size of the Corps itself. I think it's worth pointing out they also had the 5th Canadian Division, which was being broken up in Britain at the time, which provided them with a lot of at least semi-trained men as well. More important,
those actually, just to jump in there briefly, is by the start of the 100 days, all that manpower was used up. Those so there were 12 battalions in England. Like the engineers had already been stripped off, the artillery had been stripped off, so it was just the infantry. In fact, the machine guns were also stripped off. The problem was that these battalions had not been kept up to strength, so just daily losses had consumed all of that manpower before the start of the 100 days.
Yeah. On a far more important note to me is I'm going to just mention one of the forgotten titans of the First World War, which is Major General W.B. Lindsay, William Bethune Lindsay, who was, I read his report on operations at Passchendaele, which I always see as the genesis of the creation of engineering brigades, which was so important that Curry turned around and said, I would rather do without infantry if it meant I could have more engineers as well. And I think one of the things I'd like to know from both of you as Canadian historians is, why is this man so forgotten in historiography of the Canadian Corps and the First World War? I don't understand. I mean, he was the effectively the creator of Canada's unique tramways and light railway system, and he was supported by Horne against Geddes, Director General of Transportation. Can you shed some light on why he's been so forgotten?
Well, I think a couple aspects of it. One is he left no papers, so that's there's not much to grasp. But the engineering service and the CEF has not had much focus on it. There's been a handful of articles, but it's one of those, everyone tends to focus on the infantry part of the Corps when the engineers were an absolutely vital component to that. And it's I think it's only when you really dig into the individual battles that you start seeing the importance of logistics and how that has an impact. And you're absolutely right. Lindsay was a key figure, and Curry really bought into what Lindsay was selling in being able to increase the size of that engineering force in the tramways. Tim might have some perspectives as well.
I think you're right, Bill. The lack of understanding on the importance of logistics is an indication of part of the failure to study him. Curry always spoke very highly. When I was writing my book on Curry, going through his papers, always speaks so highly of Lindsay, and even reversed himself. And when Lindsay was quiet, but could be like a great engineer, where he would sort of sniff. Someone would offer some suggestion, he'd sniff at it, and Curry would kind of look at him and, do you have an opinion? You go, well, that just won't work. You've got to do this, this, and this. And Curry certainly understood his value. And in a larger sense, I would suggest that probably Canadians have a fairly good understanding of some aspects, Vimy, maybe the Canadian Corps, maybe Curry, but almost no understanding of any of the senior officers. Bill wrote a biography of Sir Richard Turner, completely forgotten by Canadians. The divisional commanders, almost completely forgotten. I've given lectures at a staff college to senior Canadian forces officers who never heard of the divisional commanders. And so, it's something we need to continue to work at. We historians who are still researching and writing, and I think sadly we're maybe getting fewer and fewer in number.
Yeah, just a rejoinder to that is that I also find it interesting that the Canadian engineering history really doesn't make much mention of him either. And if you look at the Royal Engineers, their volume, again, he barely figures into it. And I wonder, just why that is. Is it not something more than just the general forgetting of, the support services, as it were? I mean, which you find in UK as well. Any ideas on that? Why? Because, I mean, doesn't he end his days, really, 1927, prospecting for, the tar sands in Alberta?
That speaks to maybe Bill's point, where so many of the Canadian Corps officers were militia officers, or in the more technical services, railway engineers and stuff. They had jobs for them. Of course, one of the great failures that Granatstein and I is clear in our 1919 book is this once great fighting force, the Canadian Corps, is absolutely gutted in 1919. It just dissolves and is gone. And all of those lessons are gone with it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and Lindsay was, I think, a permanent force officer, but very junior. He's either a lieutenant or captain in 1914. So his rise to the chief engineer of the Corps at the beginning of 1916 is absolutely meteoric. But he is not, he's not a typical engineer officer from the British side. So he's going to be kind of dismissed from that,
very much so.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for your question. Peter Newnham.
Yes, thank you. Question for Bill, if I may. Bill, you mentioned the size of the Canadian divisions, 21,000, I think you said, as opposed to average British divisional size of 14,000. What did that mean in terms of the number of rifles available to each?
Well, the reality was that, so in theory, the Canadian division would have 3,000 more rifles. They have an extra battalion per brigade. But with the addition of 100 men, and Canadian battalions, at least until well into the 100 days, are kept up to strength. In British divisions, battalions, like during Second Arras, are cruising around 500 men. They put maybe 400 into line. You're looking at maybe 4,000 to 5,000 fewer rifles in a British division than in a Canadian division.
Quick supplemental, as is traditional. I think Tim was the person who mentioned the number of casualties at the end of the 100 days. Did that mean for the Canadian Corps then that they're roughly operating at around 50%, or were they able to be reinforced during that period?
They were reinforced. The challenge is that the men that they were getting were not as well trained. They didn't have that open warfare training. And you can see that after, during Amiens and Arras, the Canadians are operating at a very high level. But I think it was one battalion went through 8 company, by the end of August, had lost 8 company commanders, their entire intelligence detachment or group. They had pretty much lost all of their officers and gone through them twice. So by that point, you're working with very inexperienced officers, with inexperienced NCOs. Yes, they've got the manpower, but they are not able to operate at the same level as they did in August.
I think just to add to that, what hasn't been explored in the literature to that level is how do the Canadians continue to be a combat effective formation? If they lose 12,000 men at Amiens and 13,000 at Arras 3 weeks later, so you lose 25,000 casualties of a Canadian Corps, roughly 100,000, most of them to the infantry. How do you then have another battle 3 weeks later at the assault of the Canal du Nord and Cambrai, where we lose another 14,000 men in about 2 weeks of fighting? It's an astonishing series of losses. And it is partially, I think, some of the factors that Bill has talked about, the systemic, the structural factors, the senior commanders' communications, but some of it too must be pure bloody mindedness in those surviving NCOs and officers who continue to lead when you collapse 2 companies down into one, or you have an NCO commanding 4 platoons. I mean, you read this in the war diary, and it really is astonishing to think about those men at the sharp end and their ability to keep fighting in a tempo of battle which is unimaginable, I think.
Just as a further supplement to that, part of it too is the improvements in medical care, and the German artillery, at least the battle I've studied most intensely, Second Arras, plays a much smaller part in the battle. As a result, most of the wounds are caused by small arms fire, machine guns, rifles, etc. And so more of those troops are able to return maybe a couple weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. So you're still getting this infusion of veteran soldiers back into the organization. But I think Tim's point about there is a very strong core inside the Corps that is able to absorb. And that's further to the point that I made about the importance of the engineer brigades. The infantry could focus on training. So they would often get 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe a week or more of intense training to get these new recruits to be able to plug into the system.
Thanks both for your answers there. Thanks, Peter, for your question. Chris, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you very much, both. Very interesting talks. This one's principally for Tim. Tim, you talked about general support for the war in Canada. We might think of a lot of Canadians being British emigres, but presumably there was still a large French-Canadian population there. What was their attitude to the war? Presumably they would support it as their French homeland was being invaded.
Yeah, one would think, but that's not really the case. The Canadian Corps is about 620,000. The Canadian Expeditionary Force. About half of that figure are British-born, and there's a really rich, robust historiography trying to look at what does it mean to be British-born. You know, a lot of these guys came over as farmers in 1911, and they're just going straight back. Others were, came with their family when they were 2 years old and would be seen as Canadian. Of course, on top of that, a Canadian is a British subject anyways. There is no Canadian citizenship until 1947. So, it's a complex issue, but it's very clear that the Canadian Expeditionary Force and the Canadian Corps was an English fighting force. It fought as part of the British formations. Its commanders were, for the most part, English. But you're right, there is a sizable French-Canadian population in Canada, about a third of Canada. Canada is about 8 million people in 1914. About a third are French-Canadian. And they enlist in far lower ratios than English Canada. And why is that? Well, there's been pretty fierce debates over that over the last 100 years. Everything ranging from the fact that it was a British army, English army fighting for Britain. The messaging was there. In French communities, often more rural. Wherever rural communities were in Canada, they often tended to have lower enlistment. There's a whole bunch of factors, but the one that you asked there is a good one. Did French Canadians feel a strong urge to help liberate France? And here the answer is not entirely clear, but there is some evidence to suggest, yes, that is the case. Georges Vanier wrote about that and a few others. The problem is that French Canadian letters have not survived to the same extent as English Canadian ones. So we have a bit of a challenge with the actual evidence. I think for some French Canadians, there was that pull and that urge. But the reality is that in French Canada, in Quebec, the feeling was that France had abandoned Quebec in 1763. Now we're really going back here to the 7 Years' War, but they felt they had been abandoned, that they had carved out their own unique society. So there isn't that same pull. One thing I can say with certainty, there isn't the same pull as there is for large parts of English Canada to stand by Britain.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Thanks, Chris, for your question. Campbell Gordon. Campbell, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Thanks for taking my question, David. This is a question for Tim. Tim, I'm wondering, is it possible that the reason us Canadians don't remember or celebrate the liberation is that France doesn't want to remember it? Compared to the Dutch, the Dutch celebrate like crazy. They send us tulips. I'm not so sure the French does anything.
It's a good observation, and you may be right that there may be more there. I think In the 20s and the 30s, the French were quite willing to build memorials. They were quite willing to entertain British pilgrimages, Canadian pilgrimages. But you're exactly right. In both world wars, the French have a challenging history to deal with, more so in the Second World War. And we know that de Gaulle, prickly is not even getting close to the right adjective to describe him and his relation to the British and others. So you may be right there. I guess, as I wrote in my last book, The Fight for History, there's a good stream of writers in Canada who spend all their time bashing the British about everything. It's always the British fault. Sometimes it is, but in telling our story, it's got to be up to the Canadians. I mean, if we don't tell our own story here about the liberation, well, let's not expect the British or the Americans or the French to do it for us. So I think in this case, I think that we failed to tell this story. And I think those other points are quite legitimate that I made, right? The fallen. We know how heavily the specter of the dead weigh upon the memory of the First World War, whichever country you live in. We also know that for certain countries, think of Australia and Canada, there is this emergence of a nation idea, which is true, even if the hard parts have been sanded off. But then there also is the opposition to the war, the butchers and bunglers and other aspects. So there's a lot of competing narrative strands here, of which liberation doesn't really reach up to those. And I wouldn't be arguing that it should. I hope, though, that my talk left you with a little bit of some thought to say, well, maybe there's another way to think about the First World War experience for the British, for the Scottish, for the Irish, for others as well. Because I do think this liberation idea has been downplayed across the Western world.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Robert Linnell, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Hello, Bill. Hello, Tim. Nice to see you again. I've got just one small thing to add, a little quote from Curry about liberation from his diary on the 20th of October. And he said, "It is a most inspiring sight to go through all these towns and witness the joy of the inhabitants. All the houses are decorated with French flags, and the people seem overjoyed to greet the British soldiers. In many cases last night, they dug up wine they had buried for years to share it with the troops. Many of the men had a bed to sleep on again, but whether alone or not, I cannot say."
That's a great quote. Thanks for sharing it, Robert. Curry was quite a Puritan. He had real trouble with the idea that soldiers might be cavorting around, even though he was a legendary swearer. But I think maybe the more important point there is that Curry was fully moved by this liberation idea. And it was important to him. He writes about it in his 1919 official report. It's important to him because of the casualties. The casualties were a tremendous specter. And there were people in Canada who were gunning for Curry and said the losses were too heavy. What did it mean to capture Amiens to Canadians in a farm in Saskatoon or Saskatchewan or someplace, right? What they knew were the deaths of their sons and daughters and the wounding. So for Curry, it was really important for him to talk about the liberation because, as he wrote, what the Canadian Corps did was astonishing. And yet, even Curry's words, he wrote about this, even they were eventually downplayed and diminished over time. And again, not really a part of our social memory when we talk about the war.
Exactly. Thank you. It was a great talk from both of you guys.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks very much. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself there? And
yeah, thank you both for very interesting talks. And I actually a bit cheeky, and I've got a question, one for each of you. So if I may start with Bill, it's really a quickie, really. But what were the relations like between BEF and CEF on the ground? If you're talking about how the Canadian forces have got have got their act together, really, for want of a better word. Was there a sort of, were they brothers in arms, or did one consider themselves better than the other because of better organization, or what was it like for them amongst themselves together?
Well, I think you can look at it from a number of different dimensions. So in one respect, it's very different than the Australians, that there is not the contentious relationship that the Australians have with the Pommies, the Pommy Brits.
Mhm.
I'd say, at an individual level, a soldier level, like a lot of up to fairly close to the end of the war, half of those who served were born in Britain. So even though they may have come when they were 2 years old into Canada and consider themselves Canadians, there's still a very close connection to Britain. I would say that judging on some of the material that I've seen, like during the Second Battle of Arras, at the command level, there's a bit of a sniffiness the Canadians have is, oh yes, the British, they failed again, or they don't know what they're doing type of thing. And certainly Currie could get pretty starchy when he was dealing with some of the British officers like Ferguson of the 17th Corps, whom he had no respect for whatsoever. But I think generally it was a positive relationship, and certainly Currie to Horne, I think they respected each other, although I'm sure Horne got a little tired of Currie going over him all the time to Haig. Got a little sore from all the steps over his back on it by Currie.
Oh, thank you. Tim, my question to you, it's really been talked about a little bit, but I'm interested to know about how the French-speaking Canadians, did that have an impact back home when they're liberating French? Not the fighting so much, but the liberating. So they're, French-speaking, even if it is with a funny accent, talking to Belgians and French, or Wallon and France. Is there a camaraderie with that more than maybe with the English-speaking Canadians, or wasn't there that much of a divide between the two divisions within?
It's a good question, Sarah. Thank you. Yes, there was one all French battalion. It was the 22nd Battalion in the 2nd Division, and they're part of the liberation. And they have a quite different experience where, they write about, oh my gosh, like the French are amazed because we're speaking to them in their tongue, and they have a great relationship, and they talk about the drinking and the singing in the old French songs and the new French Canadian songs. So there really is a strong relationship there. And what's interesting is those French Canadians who come back to Canada in 1919. Well, they're welcomed in French Canada, primarily in Montreal and Quebec City, the two biggest cities in the province of Quebec. They're greeted as champions who come back, and there's huge parades and celebrations. And Serge Durflinger, a historian at the University of Ottawa, has written about this. It's really interesting. And the 22nd Battalion is almost held up as a symbol, like to the rest of Canada, saying, "Look at what our soldiers did." Now they still enlisted in lower proportionate numbers, but yet there was a symbol there. The anger from French Canada to English Canada was often at a higher level, political elites, which was stoked over time. Now, there was undeniable anger, unrest, division during the war over conscription, primarily in the summer of 1917 and 1918. I don't want to leave the wrong impression here, but the way that history becomes politicized, the service becomes weaponized, becomes much later in the 50s and 60s, when there's a second or a very strong separatist movement in Quebec. So it's a really complex idea, but I think your question is a good one, and it is, did the French Canadian soldiers have a different liberation experience? They seem to have, yeah, and they seem to have great fun. And English Canadians talked about finding the one French guy in the platoon, because French Canadians served all throughout the fighting units, who's invariably French, nicknamed Frenchie or something, and getting him to translate and figure out where the vin blanc is and where to get the beer and stuff. And yeah, so, but that too is a part of this story.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. We've got a question from Graham Evans, who unfortunately can't join us for technical reasons. Graham has asked the following. My grandfather ended the 100 days on the 11th of November 18 with the soldiers of the Canadian Corps at Mons, or so he told me. Given that Grandad was a Lewis gunner in the Middlesex Regiment, part of the 56th London Division, was this assertion true? Did the British and Canadian troops fight side by side at Mons? I suppose what Graham's saying here is, did the 56th Division join hands with the Canadian Corps at Mons? Any ideas on that, chaps?
I don't think so. It was two battalions, the 42nd Battalion and the RCR's Royal Canadian Regiment, that liberated Mons on the early hours of November 11th. And the Canadian Corps had a fairly large sector, of which Mons was in the center and the Canadians were advancing. And in fact, there were some Canadian units to the northeast of Mons, so they were past Mons. I think what the story here is that Mons, of course, those of us who have been there, is a very large city. And it was at the time a place for billeting soldiers. And I don't doubt for one second that there were British soldiers there probably after November 11th, maybe even on the 11th, although I think it was only the Canadians that marched actually into Mons. I guess, Bill, we'd have to see if it was, did you say the 56th Division? I don't think it was attached to the Canadian Corps. So more than likely he was there, but probably a few days after. And to soldiers, I think, and this is worth reflecting on, November 11th means a lot to us. We know that now. I'm not sure what it meant to the soldiers at the time. There was great celebration when the war ended at 11 o'clock. But many soldiers also believed that it might continue. And of course, it was just a temporary armistice. There was a very real chance that the Germans could keep fighting. And so was November 11th seen as an extended pause for most soldiers? Were they simply exhausted? I recounted in one of my books 2 soldiers in a trench who refused to get out of it. And an officer is standing over them, looking down, saying, "You guys, we can get out now. We can get out now. The war's over." And one of them looks up at him and says, "Who won?"
Well, just to, further to that point is that as you went further from the front, the more likely there would be celebrations. There were raucous celebrations in Canada at some of the, or in England at some of the camps, training camps that the Canadians occupied. In fact, one of them is treated as a riot. But as you get closer to the front, it's a far more muted response. It's more, okay, I guess it's over, but no one's, not a lot are dancing at that point.
Sure. Thanks for that. Peter's asked a question. This is possibly one for Bill, but for either of you. Can you guys talk about the tanks in the 100 days, as that wasn't particularly mentioned in Bill's talk? Either of you, throw it open to either of you.
Okay, so the Canadians had support of, I think, 4 tank battalions at Amiens. And so the tanks played a major role on the first day, but each day subsequently, the number of tanks diminished significantly. And at Arras, for most of the battle, there was very little, like sometimes there was as few as 9 tanks supporting the Canadian Corps attack. It was only on the last major day of the fighting on the 2nd of September, there were even 50 tanks that participated in the attack. So the tank corps was basically gutted after Amiens, and there were only handfuls of tanks made available. In some cases, a tank battalion would be assigned, and it would have to pull training tanks. It'd have to lend or borrow tanks from another unit to try and get as much as 9 tanks to support an attack. So the role of the tanks diminished significantly as the battle went on because there just weren't that many of them left running.
Thanks for that, Bill. Tim?
If I was to add just one thing to that, I would say that the combined arms warfare of the Canadian Corps and the British by 1918 is the all-arms battle where artillery and infantry are absolutely crucial. But when you layer in armored warfare and air power and communications and logistics and machine gun units and motorized mortar units, it's a really well-rounded fighting force. And I think The tanks, while they were always made a tremendously positive impression on the Canadians, when you look at the official records, as I know Bill has, as I have, you begin to scratch your head and wonder where they really are after about the second day of MEN. And they're broken down, they're burned out, they're knocked out, or they're fighting on other fronts, I suppose.
And just to extend that, I think we have to recognize just how fragile and limited were these weapons. By Arras, the Canadians had given strict instructions. The tanks are never to be used without barrage support, without smoke, or in fog, or at night. So you can only use them in the initial stages of an attack. If you're going to do a deep advance, you can't use the tanks in the later stages, because the German anti-tank efforts have improved to such an extent, it's almost instant death. And at Drocourt-Queant line, every tank that crossed beyond the first objective was knocked out by the Germans. So they had they're very fragile, they're very powerful, like it's a heavyweight fighter with a glass jaw. So used in the right situations, they can be a great benefit, but you can't use them everywhere and at all times.
David, can I add one more thought there? I know this is annoying, but I just want to add one more to what Bill said. I think the key role of the tanks in these battles is to draw fire away from the infantry. And you can see that in the German attack doctrine. When they're using artillery in a direct fire role, they're focusing a lot on the tanks because they're very fearful. I think, Bill, you'd agree. But what is happening is that artillery isn't being directed against the Canadian infantry. And the Canadian infantry know to stay clear of those tanks whenever they can.
That's grand. Thanks very much. Thanks for your question there, Peter. Right, I've got a point coming here from Paul Cobb about the 56th Division question. Paul's pointed out that by the end of 10th of November, the division had been withdrawn for a rest, although the artillery was still in action up to the armistice at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November. The forward infantry on that date was at Harveng, about 8 miles south of Mons. So we've answered the 56th Division question.
Excellent.
Pretty efficiently. So thanks for that,
Thank
Paul. Another question, and I'm conscious that time's marching on, so we might have to close it down shortly. But we've got another question about French Canadians, which seems to be coming back quite frequently. This may be for Tim. So Richard Crow, who hasn't got a video, asks, did the French Canadians see that fighting in the war was a possible lever for independence?
Great question, Richard. And not initially, nobody is talking about that. But when conscription erupts in the summer of 1917, there is the spark of a sovereignty movement. And to give you an example, in Montreal, the largest city in Canada at the time, and the largest city, obviously, in Quebec, there are demonstrations every night of 15 to 20,000 people every single night protesting against conscription. And that there is a bit of a spark. A member of parliament offers, in a kind of cheeky way in the House of Commons, a suggestion that if English Canada is not happy with Quebec, maybe Quebec should separate. He pulls that. It was more theater than substance. But the divisions from the First World War, those divisions, they linger to this day. And I think when we talk about the legacy of war, when we think about the First World War for Canada, you know, this is the war that propels Canada forward to a greater sense of its own identity, its own standing, great pride in standing shoulder to shoulder with Britain, the success of the Canadian Corps, the heroes like Curie or the Victoria Cross recipients or nursing sisters, home front, massive contributions. And yet there is a darker strain as well, as we know in all war efforts in Britain, as in Ireland, Scotland, and others. And I think that is a legacy of war that historians need to remind themselves of when they talk about, in this case, Canada, that it forever changes the country, not always for the good.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to make this the last question, and the question's coming from Bill from Bill Twist for Tim, and I'll just read this out. I fully appreciate your comments re the emergence of Canadian nationhood in the Great War. Why was it, though, that in 1940 and 41, particularly with the Air Forces, were thousands of Canadians volunteering for service with the RAF in another European war at a time that the evidence of Nazi atrocities had at that stage remained yet to be revealed?
Yeah. So I think the question is, why were Canadians, why did Canadians serve in the Second World War? And then why did Canadians serve with British units in the Second World War?
I think that's the gist of it. Yeah.
Canada was firmly committed during the Second World War. Canada, with the Statute of Westminster from 1931, would decide its own fate on the. Canadians went to war, again, I would argue, to stand by Britain, but also because they believed in the necessity of that war. They understood that. And that war, which was initially the government of the day tried to have a limited war, and really it was a massive Canadian contribution, 1.1 million Canadians in uniform fighting on all fronts and the home front. And I won't go into all the details there. But that was firmly seen as Canada's contribution, that Canada would stand by the Western Allies. As a junior ally, we shouldn't claim too much for Canada, but as an important ally. Why did Canadians serve with British units? That's a great question. And it's more complex. It's that we didn't have enough RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons at the start. We had the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which trained up 131,000 airmen, Canadian, British, New Zealand, Australians, Americans as well, others. Many of them were fed into RAF units. And there doesn't appear to have been a great uproar over that. It was sort of understood. And by the end of the war, about half the Canadians served in RCAF and half served in RAF. And I think it's a reminder, again, of the close ties between Canada and Britain during the Second World War, through that war, even though that war also pushes Canada into a very different trajectory, really becoming a North American nation through trade and commerce. But there were many millions of Canadians who had very strong links to Britain up until about the 1960s, scholars tell us. And then a kind of stronger Canadian identity began to emerge as that older generation passed on. So it's a great question, complex one. But Canadians, I guess the key question is, the Second World War was very much seen as Canada's war.
If I could just interject just briefly, is that there was a generation that grew up in the 20s and 30s where aircraft was this green promise, the technology, and Canadians had great success in the air in the First World War. So didn't want to serve in the infantry, and if you didn't, the Navy was sort of an unsung service, and especially in the early part, it was you could make an impact, you could fight as an individual in the air service. And as Tim alluded to, there's not a lot of RCAF opportunities. So if you are of that bent, you have that technology, the type of kids that today would get into computers were getting into aircraft, and that the allure of flying and being able to have an impact as an individual was all very attractive. And if the only way you could do is with the British, well, that's the way you're going to do it.
Perfect. Thanks very much indeed, gents. There are more questions, but frankly, it's now 20 to 10 UK time. So I think we're going to call that a day. We've had a really good exploration of a number of themes on the questions, and it's been not the talks themselves are absolutely first rate, but I've really enjoyed the Q&As as well, and hope everybody else watching it has enjoyed the questions. A final round of applause, please, from everybody who's still watching this. And Tim and Bill, his hands going up left, right, and centre as a virtual thank you. So from me, thanks very much, Tim and Bill, for your efforts tonight, or in your case this afternoon, and truly appreciate putting the time in. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for watching. It's been a pleasure once again to bring this to a wide public, and please do come and join us at the Western Front Association for more of these webinars in coming weeks and months. But from me and from Tim and Bill, that's it for tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Take care.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get all